This is a recording of a new feature that is coming in CIS 2.5. And as you said, this feature is really under preview. And so this is an introduction of a feature called HubMode. And this HubMode feature is applied to an AS3 config map. And so what's been more prevalent and what we're seeing more and more of is groups or users or personas being responsible for different components within Kubernetes. So for example, you can see here from the left and the right of this diagram, you can see that the infrastructure provider is responsible for creation or creating of the ingress classes. So this infrastructure provider would ultimately be the user that would create the config map. And the application developer would be responsible for his or her application, and the application developer would create the pod, deploy the pod, as well as create the service, which is really the creation of the endpoints itself. And CIS needs those services not only for service discovery for ConfigMap, but also to classify the endpoint and the protocol and the ports that it's running on. And so that's actually quite interesting. But what we're learning and what we're seeing from a lot of our customers out there is that the infrastructure provider and the application developer really are in two projects or two different projects or multiple different projects. So for example, the infrastructure provider could be using the default tenant or default namespace, and the application developer could be using his or her namespace. And so that's the example that I'm going to demonstrate today. And Config Hub takes care of all of this, removes the namespace isolation, removes the tie between the config map and the namespace. What you're seeing in the right now is another additional mode where they're introducing more of a cluster operator. And so the operator is creating the pod as well as the service. And what I'm also seeing is that the pod and service cannot be modified. So a lot of the modification needs to happen within the infrastructure provider itself. And the infrastructure provider has to mitigate any of the challenges that are created by this cluster operator. So by this second mode here, it's introducing potentially great workflows and tools for the application developers. And CIS, by interacting with these cluster operators, can actually be quite powerful, specifically with helping to accelerate the developer's experience and specific workflows tooling. So let's go ahead and take a look at the examples with the demo. So as you can see here, I have a service called F5 Hello World N1 or just N1 service, and you'll notice that it is in namespace N1. And if we go ahead and take a look at this service, let's go to this user guide and we'll take a look at the service. This user guide is, and we're going to bring up the specific service, and let's go ahead and take a look at the pod deployment. Let's look at the service one. And so what's really interesting here, and I'll make this a little bit bigger so that we can see it, is that the service with a namespace of N1, and these are labels used for service discovery. And in this case here, I'm just using cluster IP. But the most important thing here is the namespace of N1. If we take a look at another service that I've created here called N2, you will see here that I am deploying this in namespace 2, and these are the associated pods for those services. As you can see, this is the deployment pod or the deployment manifest, and this is deployed in namespace 1. So the pods themselves, as well as the services that are being deployed, are both being deployed in namespace 1 and namespace 2. And so as you can see, we can see that there is the service 1 and there is the service 2 with the cluster IP used for connecting, as well as the specific ports. So that's actually quite interesting. And so in CIS 2.4, the config map that you would deploy would have to match the namespace deployed in the service. But that somewhat kind of breaks this model if the infrastructure provider is deploying the config map in, let's say, service default, and the application developer is deploying the config map in namespace 1 or namespace 2. So in 2.4, that creates a problem, and hence the introduction of config map hub mode. So how do we enable this hub mode config map? Let's go ahead and take a look at that example as well as the config map itself. And so you can see here is the config map itself, and this is the infrastructure provider that creates the config map using the default namespace, which then maps to the namespace, which maps to the service. And how it maps to the service is using these service discovery labels. So this is what's really important here, the service discovery labels. As you can see, this is the name of the tenant, this is the name of the tenant here, this is application A1, which is the app itself, and so that's how the application maps over there. And then this is the web pool, and this is how the web pools match. And you can see that's how the service discovery is happening. That's how CIS is populating the pool members within the big IP. So this is interesting. This config map will scan all services and look for the specific service discovery labels. So if we look at the examples a little closer, which we followed earlier, there is nothing that you necessarily need to do in the CIS arguments. The only thing that is really important in the CIS arguments is to make sure that config maps is equal to true. So that's really all you need to do it from that perspective. But what is required is in the config map itself is to enable this tag called config map is equal to true. So if config map is equal to true, then the config map namespace doesn't have to match the namespace of the pod or service in this example. If you change the config map to false, then namespace isolation will be enforced. Now, CIS can listen to all namespaces or multiple namespaces. You'll notice that in the arguments here, you don't have to specify the namespaces. CIS by default will listen to all namespaces, but if you wanted to specify the namespaces that CIS is listening to, you could specify them in the arguments, but you don't have to in this case. You just have to specify hub mode is equal to true. So let's go ahead and enable this config map. So kubectl create, and we'll create that config map. You can see there is the AS3 declaration. So that has been posted. There is an update there on HubMode. That is the name of the tenant. That was updated. If we go take a look at Big AP, scroll down to the tenant layer. I did see the update. There it is right there. And you can see these are populated. So this would be my first config map, my second config map. These are in two different namespaces. This is namespace 1, this is namespace 2, and you'll notice I have two pool members, pool member for namespace 1, pool member for namespace 2. Hitting these applications, in this application there's 4 nodes. But that's really the creation of the app here. But I think this is actually what's really important, namespace 1, namespace 2. If we go back and look at the config map, let's take a look at the config map. So all of these examples are on the user guide so you can pull down these examples. Just clone this repo and you can get access to these examples. So let's take a look at this config map. So you'll notice that hub mode is equal to true. And we'll scroll down right here. There is A1, that's the tenant name. This is application A1. You'll see that under application A1 I have a label. This is just a virtual server description, virtual server name, A180 virtual server name. I'm using this specific address. Here's my pool. This is pool for N1. And so these are the names or the labels that are matching. And you can see here's application 2, application 2, A2, etc. If you wanted to deploy potentially multiple config maps, you can do that as well. In this case, I've done one config map, but you could add multiple config maps if you want. That is no problem. That's totally up to you. It depends upon how you want to manage this. Maybe you group these applications together. Since these are port 80 applications, maybe you group them together and you build the same declaration for all of these applications instead of deploying one app per declaration. With that way, it's better potentially maybe to reuse objects instead of creation of multiple objects. However, that's for a different video, different discussion. So let me just go ahead and talk a little bit about this and close this off. So this is a preview of what's coming in CIS 2.5, specifically a preview for HubMode. You're welcome to use this. This is not production, of course, because it's an unreleased piece of software, but it's really just there for testing. CIS 2.5 is a middle of July release. We still got 3 sprints to go. So there's going to be quite a lot in this release. But this is a preview for HubMode, which allows you to create a config map where the config map is using a different namespace than the pod or the service itself. Thank you very much. Let me know if you have any questions.